Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, between weeks 7 through 14, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers in order to indicate which matchups we have to play our wide receivers against and are the most advantageous, and which matchups we might want to avoid based on cornerback coverage. After we talk about that subject, we'll then transition into our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justifies my rankings going into the given week. Before we talk about the rankings, again, do not forget, rankings are always subject to change. It's only Wednesday. There's a lot of time between now and Sunday, which is absolutely going to present more information, whether it is injuries, whether it's injuries to potential defensive players, quarterbacks, all of that information taken into account, variables that could potentially lead to successes or failures of our players. So be sure to stay up to date on our latest content. We'll have Sunday morning rankings up to date prior to NFL kickoff. So if you guys are interested in getting your lineup straight, ready to go, be sure to join us. Be sure to subscribe. Of course, we post daily content on the channel regarding 2022 fantasy football, not only to help you win your weekly matchups, but of course, in this current circumstance, try to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship as we're trying to get through the playoffs. Thank you very much. Also, before we begin today's content, I want to remind you guys, it is the 12 Days of Pickmas going on right now via PrizePicks. We have the 12 Days of Pickmas. Each of the next 12 days prior to Christmas, there is a new promotion that is going to be available to the public that you can go ahead and make an entry on. Today, as of December 14th, the current promotion is as such. So for those of you who are trying to take advantage of it, be sure to go ahead, travel to their website. There's a link down in the description. You can use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first-time deposit, because when you make that first-time deposit, is immediately doubled up to $100. Go ahead and check that out today, and go ahead and take advantage of the 12 Days of Pickmas. Thank you very much. All right. Let's get into talking about Week 15 wide receivers, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right side of the screen, I've gone ahead and isolated wide receiver receiving statistics alone. So receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns over the course of the last 8 weeks. And when you go ahead and isolate these statistics, we find that the Minnesota Vikings are giving up the most half PPR fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers on a per game basis. Of course, giving up 9 touchdowns, 1,581 receiving yards, 118 receptions, a boatload of statistics across the board. And they're followed by the Detroit Lions, Tennessee Titans, 49ers, Buffalo Bills, New York Giants. Secondaries that have struggled over the course of the last month or so and are continuing to do so as we enter the fantasy football playoffs. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have defenses like the Jets, the Texans, the Colts that continue to have really high levels of play from their cornerback positions, and as secondaries haven't had to deal with too many injuries that could potentially impact their overall for success. Now that we take this information and give you guys a visual representation as to how many fantasy points are being allowed, it gives you a little bit of an indication as to which of these wide receivers we could trust just a little bit more based on given matchups. We'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode, as I'll be referring to specific fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, one-on-one cornerback versus wide receiver matchups over the course of this upcoming week, to give you guys a little bit more information on the matter. But either way, throwing this information at you so you can use it to the best of your ability and help you in your decision making. All right, outside of that, let's go ahead and transition into talking about our Week 15 top 36 wide receiver rankings. Beginning with our number 1, we have Justin Jefferson. He is coming off of an incredible career high 223 receiving yards. And the funny thing about that incredible game is he was also supposed to have a touchdown added to his scoreline, but unfortunately, I guess, stepped out of bounds on that sideline. Didn't really look like he was out of bounds. Either way, it's funny to see that Justin Jefferson, back in Week 3 against the Detroit Lions, put up his career low of 14 receiving yards and his fantasy point low of 2.9 fantasy points in a given week, to then go ahead and turn it around just 11 weeks later in Week 14 in an incredible productive week. 11 catches, 223. Again, 27.8 half PPR fantasy points. We know that he's a stud wide receiver. We know that he's matchup proof. Even though he takes on the Indianapolis Colts secondary, the Stephon Gilmore matchup certainly is going to be a challenge, but it's Justin Jefferson. It doesn't matter who's lining up against him. He's going to continue to get the job done, and he's an automatic play. Moving on to our number 2. Speaking of an automatic play, we have Davante Adams. Unfortunately, Davante Adams should have been incredible last Thursday, in which he took on the Los Angeles Rams on a short week. But unfortunately, the play calling and, of course, Derek Carr just weren't able to keep up. And the fact of the matter is, only getting 3 targets in the second half is not enough for one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. Someone who has already surpassed, 80 receptions, 1,000 receiving yards, and 12 touchdowns this season. He needs to continue to get 7 targets a half minimum, especially when you don't have guys like Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow out there who going into this week could potentially return from their injured reserve stints, which could even open up more for Davante Adams. That all being said, the fact that he had 0 receptions in the second half of that Rams game, I'm sure they're going to address that. Carr only had 9 passing attempts in that second half. I'm sure they'll address that. They're going up against the New England Patriots. We've seen a lot of wide receiver ones put up great numbers against them as of late. DeAndre Hopkins, 7 catches, 79 yards. Diggs, 7 catches, 92 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson, 9 catches, 139 and a touchdown. I'm expecting Davante Adams to have himself a bounce-back week here. Moving on to our number 3, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase has been incredible. Over the course of the last 4 games that he has played, he is averaging 11 targets, 8 catches, 120 receiving yards, and 1.25 receiving touchdowns per game, which is a 23.6 half PPR fantasy point per game average. The amount of production that we're continuing to see from Ja'Marr Chase, incredible. Of course, the absence of one T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd from that game certainly made an impact on the fact that Ja'Marr Chase had 15 targets against their division rival in the Cleveland Browns. Were able to beat them for the first time in the last 5 matchups. Pretty good overall, performance from him, to say the very least. This upcoming week, they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We know that Ja'Marr Chase is an automatic start, but the matchup isn't easy. Over the course of the last 5 games, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, on average, are only allowing about 11 receptions, 147 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown to the entirety of an opposing offense's wide receivers. So if we're going to expect T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase to coexist, it's going to be a tough matchup, but the way that the Cincinnati Bengals have looked, they're playoff ready, and I think they're going to roll through this Tampa Bay defense. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, our number 4. All right, the expectation of this game is going to be high winds, perhaps some snow, and most definitely cold weather. Now, the question is, what can we potentially expect to see from Stefon Diggs? I'm sure he's used to the weather because he's played in Buffalo for the last 2-3 years now. So if we're going to be in a conversation about him being limited, it's not a matter of him being limited rather than the opposing team that's going to have to come in, which is, of course, the Miami Dolphins, who aren't used to that weather. So in the case of Stefon Diggs, I'm not concerned, especially considering the fact that in the last, 5 games that he's taken on the Miami Dolphins since joining the Buffalo Bills, from 2020 to 2022, he's been averaging 14.76 half PPR fantasy points per game with a 9.4 target average, and going up against Xavier Howard. Honestly, it's an advantageous matchup. We just saw Mike Williams dominate as the number 1 last week against this defense. I'm expecting Stefon Diggs to follow suit. Moving on, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Now, even though Tyreek Hill is going to have his hands full going up against the Buffalo Bills secondary, Tre'Davious White back, of course, the rookie cornerback returned. We have Jordan Poyer back there. There's going to be a completely rebuilt secondary for the Buffalo Bills like they've had, specifically last week. Going forward, it's going to be a tough matchup for Tyreek Hill, but we know that Tyreek Hill just needs one play to take the top off of a defense or potentially recover a fumble and run it in for a touchdown. It doesn't really matter. I know he's dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury going into this week. He still was able to return in last week's game against the Los Angeles Chargers. He played well, 22.1 fantasy points, continue his streak of success against that defense, continuing to put up great numbers. But we have to remember, this is a game that, again, very cold weather. The last time these two teams met was in Florida. The weather wasn't a problem, and still we only got Tyreek Hill with 2 catches for 33 yards. I know it was that Tua back injury game, concussion game, but it's going to be a tough one to say the very least. Not only that, we're in a conversation here where Tua last week was 3 for 18 passing at one point in that game. If Tua is not able to put it together, we could see a lot of trouble, but all he really needs is 1 reception for a touchdown, and he can pretty much make his week with the yardage that he gains from that. Moving on, let's talk about A.J. Brown. Another one of these automatic plays. Going into the week, A.J. Brown is coming off of a 3 consecutive game streak of scoring a touchdown. And yes, it's not the Tyler Lockett streak of games, which we'll get to in just a moment, but he is still putting up great numbers. And primarily, the Eagles as an offense, even without Dallas Goedert out there, have been unstoppable over the course of the last 3 weeks. Everyone is scoring, whether it's DeVonta Smith, A.J. Brown, Miles Sanders. Of course, with his legs, Jalen Hurts dominating. But, again, the scores for the Eagles over the course of the last 3 games, 40, 35, 48 as an offense. They are dominating defenses. They take on the Chicago Bears defense, which has certainly been struggling all season long, been one of the worst in the National Football League. I'm expecting to see another huge performance here from A.J. Brown, the primary number 1 wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles. We're not 100% certain as to whether or not Dallas Goedert returns, but even if he does, that's primarily only going to impact the overall production and opportunity of DeVonta Smith, which we'll get to in a bit. All right, moving on to our number 7, another automatic play. We have CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. I just want to remind you guys, even though CeeDee Lamb's coming off of an underwhelming 5.8 half PPR fantasy points, he has still been able to produce 14.5 fantasy points minimum in 4 out of the last 6 games that he has participated in. So we're going to get ourselves into a conversation as to his consistency. It's certainly been there, and every now and then you're going to get a couple performances where it doesn't click. That being said, Going into this upcoming week, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, this should be an exciting matchup. And hopefully, if Trevor Lawrence shows up, the Trevor Lawrence that we know is a really top-tier quarterback in this league, if he shows up and he's capable of dicing up this Dallas Cowboys secondary that has obviously dealt with a lot of injuries as late, whether it's corner or safety, there may be a conversation to be had here where this could be a back-and-forth, higher-scoring game between these two teams. Most recently, wide receiver ones against this Jacksonville secondary. Of course, Davante Adams, 10 catches, 146 and 2 touchdowns. Kadarius Toney and Marquez Valdes-Scantling both finding the end zone against this secondary. Chark, 5 catches for 98. Amon-Ra St. Brown in that game, 11 catches, 114, 2 touchdowns. And even Nick Westbrook-Ikine, with the boatload of air yards that he wasn't able to take advantage of, still was able to find himself in the end zone. I'm expecting CeeDee Lamb to be a great play this week. Moving on to Christian Watson, the thumbnail for today's video. Many of you were wondering where I was going to have him based on the thumbnail, I'm sure. And again, he's just on a 4-game streak of dominating the National Football League. In the last 4 games, his averages are 7 targets, 4 catches, 78 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns per game. That in itself is unbelievable. It's a 22.93 half PPR fantasy point per game average. Over the course of those 4 weeks, nobody's really been able to keep up with the production of one Christian Watson. He's been able to put up 4 consecutive performances of 19 or more fantasy points. What more can we ask for him? At this point, coming off the bye week, healthy, ready to go, with Aaron Rodgers, of course, and his thumb feeling a little bit better, we're in a position here where Christian Watson against the LA Rams in Green Bay, cold weather, could be asked to do a lot against this secondary. I'm expecting a huge performance here and to continue his momentum in the late half of the season. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Lockett. Another one of these players that cannot stop scoring touchdowns. In fact, currently Tyler Lockett is on a 6 consecutive game streak of scoring touchdowns. The fact of the matter is, he is the Ezekiel Elliott of the wide receiver position, and they can't be touchdown dependent when they continue to score it. And Geno Smith, of course, is playing incredible, and so is DK Metcalf on the other side of the field. They take on, of course, the San Francisco 49ers on Thursday. It's a tough matchup. Division rival will determine who ends up potentially winning this division in the NFC West. That being said, the last time these two teams faced, Tyler Lockett, 11 targets, 9 catches, 107 through the air, 15.2 fantasy points. In 10 out of his last 12 games, Tyler Lockett is at 10 or more fantasy points. He has been an incredible wide receiver in fantasy. You're obviously firing him up for another big week here. Moving on to our number 10, Terry McLaurin. We talked about Terry McLaurin against the New York Giants just a couple weeks back. And what exactly did he do? He was an absolute incredible smash must-start play. And going into this week, I'm keeping that same energy. I expect Terry McLaurin to dice up this secondary. With Adoree Jackson being out since week 11, we have seen wide receivers dominate against this secondary. Just to give you guys some perspective, besides the fact that Terry McLaurin in week 13 put up 20.5 against this defense, we've seen A.J. Brown 15.0. We've seen DeVonta Smith 14.9. Jahan Dotson 13.9. CeeDee Lamb 14.7. We've seen incredible performances across the board from wide receivers against this secondary. I'm expecting Terry McLaurin to have himself another big week. Do not forget, Terry McLaurin has never had a game in his career against the New York Giants where he has put up less than 70 receiving yards. In fact, in the last 2 games that he's played against this defense with Taylor Heineke at quarterback, he's put up a minimum of 8 receptions, 100 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown per game. 20-plus fantasy points in each of those contests. And over the course of his career against the Giants, averaging 16.33 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting a huge performance here out of Terry McLaurin. As should you. Start him up. Moving on. Let's talk about DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf, even though all the attention is kind of being pulled in the direction of Tyler Lockett's consistency of scoring touchdowns in the last 6 weeks here, DK Metcalf hasn't been, taking his foot off the pedal. He's, in fact, been accelerating and getting himself even more fantasy points at times than Tyler Lockett. In specific, from weeks 8 through 14, DK Metcalf has been averaging 14.93 fantasy points per game. In the last 4 games, he's put up a minimum of 71 receiving yards each. Now he goes up against a defense in the San Francisco 49ers, which of course Charvarius Ward is going to be the primary coverage. The last time these two teams faced, back in week 2, the offense wasn't the same. And even though Tyler Lockett was able to find success, DK Metcalf was not. But I'm expecting another big week here for DK Metcalf because in 9 out of his last 11 performances, he has put up a minimum of 10 fantasy points. Another big performance on the horizon here for DK Metcalf, as the running game is going to probably be nullified by the 49ers, forcing Geno to throw for the entirety of this game. Moving on, let's talk about the final of our wide receiver ones. We have Garrett Wilson. Again, like I mentioned a couple weeks back to many of you, I am going to be potentially playing Garrett Wilson and Christian Watson as a top 12 option for the remainder of the season. They are the Amon-Ra St. Browns of this season. Now, going into this week, speaking of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson takes on the Detroit Lions secondary. One of the best matchups you could possibly ask for. In fact, the second best matchup since week 7. Now, since we have seen the benching of Zach Wilson, we've seen an incredible streak of games from, of course, the efforts of Garrett Wilson. Let's not forget, in the 6 games that we have seen Garrett Wilson with a different starting quarterback, whether it be Mike White and or Joe Flacco, he's still averaging 16.18 fantasy points per game, averaging 10.5 targets, 6.2 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and 0.67 receiving touchdowns per game. That's 4 out of the last 6 games that he's participated in. I'm expecting incredible production, primarily because of this matchup. Again, the secondary has not been able to stop opposing wide receivers. We just saw Justin Jefferson go for his career high of 223 receiving yards. Of course, KJ Osborne in that game, 38 and a touchdown on 5 catches. Thielen, back to his normal self. We'll talk about him in a bit. 7 catches, 65 and a touchdown. Stefon Diggs the week prior, 8 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Isaiah McKenzie in that same game, 6 catches, 96 and a touchdown. Of course, the Detroit Lions can stop the run. And when, in fact, you stop the run against the New York Jets, they're going to air it out with Mike White. I'm expecting a huge game here for Garrett Wilson. Moving on to our number 13, it is Keenan Allen. I think it is a little bit underwhelming to see Keenan Allen at number 13 based on what he has been able to accomplish over the course of the last 4 games. He's been averaging 11 targets, 7 catches, 81 receiving yards, and 0.5 touchdowns per game, which is a 14.07 half PPR fantasy point per game average. In the last 2 games alone, he has garnered 14 targets each game. Unbelievable levels of opportunity for Keenan Allen, and that's why we drafted him in the offseason, because we knew that his combination and his connection with Justin Herbert was elite. I mean, you go back to 2020, 2021, in the games in which Justin Herbert played with Keenan Allen, they were averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format when neither of them left early with an injury. We're expecting huge production once again here, especially considering the Tennessee Titans matchup. Again, the Tennessee Titans have given up huge points, over 100 yards to Higgins, over 100 yards to, of course, DeVonta Smith, AJ Brown, and even Zay Jones a couple weeks back, 8 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Big performances across the board from wide receivers. I'm expecting Keenan Allen to thrive within the matchup. Moving on. Amon-Ra St. Brown's at number 14. We've mentioned him a couple times already today, but even though he is outside of my top 12 rankings, let this not alarm you. Last week, he still led the team in terms of total targets, but going into this weekend's matchup, it is a difficult secondary matchup overall. You got guys like Sauce Gardner, Michael Carter II, which is the slot cornerback for the New York Jets, and quite frankly, when you go ahead and look at the matchup across the board, it's going to be difficult, especially considering the fact that running the ball last week for the Detroit Lions wasn't really effective. And if we're going to continue to witness low levels of efficiency in terms of the running game, it'll force the ball out of Jared Goff's hands and, of course, in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown, despite how difficult Michael Carter II is in terms of a slot cornerback. I'm not talking about the running back there. They have another player on the Jets. His name is Michael Carter. Either way, even though Michael Carter has given up, the 3rd most targets to opposing slot wide receivers, 56 total, the 5th most receptions, 39 total, and the 7th most receiving yards, it primarily has to do with the fact that quarterbacks cannot target any other receiving options because Sauce Gardner is locking up the field. So at this moment, I'm expecting Amon-Ra to be a great option. Hopefully he can find the end zone. If he doesn't, I think the number 14 spot is fair in a half PPR, obviously higher in a full PPR based on his reception count. Moving on. Let's talk about Mike Williams, another one of these big time wide receivers that could definitely make a play and put up, 20 fantasy points when you least expect it. Last week, in his return week, finally healthy after a full week of healthy practice, puts together a 20.6 fantasy point productive week, 6 catches for 116 and a touchdown. The numbers that I wanted to mention in regards to Mike Williams is the fact that in 5 out of his last 8 games, he has produced 15 or more half PPR fantasy points. On top of that, in those games, it's either been over 100 receiving yards or a touchdown that has helped him accomplish over those 15 fantasy points. In terms of his overall performances over the course of, the last 2 years, in the last 5 consecutive away games, he's been able to produce 100 or more receiving yards. This upcoming week, it's an away game in Tennessee. He could end up breaking the record for the streak of games of 100 plus receiving yards in terms of away games at the wide receiver position. I'm expecting a huge performance here, especially considering, again, like I mentioned before with Keenan Allen, we've seen guys like AJ Brown, 8 catches, 119, 2 touchdowns. DeVonta Smith, 5 catches, 102 and a touchdown. T. Higgins, 7 catches, 114 and a touchdown against the secondary just as of late. Moving on to our number 16, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Even though the injury of Kyler Murray is certainly going to impact the overall potential for success of DeAndre Hopkins for the remainder of the season, I expect the talent of DeAndre Hopkins and, of course, the opportunities that he's going to be granted to allow him to be a relevant fantasy option as a wide receiver to going forward. Primarily because in the last 3 games that we have seen DeAndre Hopkins and Colt McCoy play together this season, he has averaged 12 targets, 9 catches, 89 receiving yards, no touchdowns per game, but again, 12.6 half PPR fantasy points per game on average. They take on the Denver Broncos this upcoming week. We have seen multiple wide receivers over the course of the last couple of weeks, whether it be a JuJu Smith-Schuster or a Davante Adams, dominate against this defense. If Colt McCoy is going to continue to send double-digit targets in the direction of DeAndre Hopkins, of course, expect success. Moving on, let's talk about DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith has been an unbelievable fantasy prospect in the last couple of weeks. We talked about him many weeks ago as, hey, you got to trade for DeVonta Smith. And unfortunately, as soon as I mentioned that, he ends up having inconsistent performances. Then Dallas Goedert unfortunately gets hurt. And here comes a streak of games from DeVonta Smith that absolutely is dominating the fantasy realm. At this current moment in time, we're coming off of a 5 consecutive game streak of 8 or more targets in which he's been averaging 12.46 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. With the absence of Dallas Goedert and the potential eligibility of him returning this week, it could make an impact on the overall success of DeVonta Smith. But if they are slow to make Dallas Goedert return, because again, they're looking towards the playoffs, they're the #1 team in the NFC. They don't have to rush anything back. If we can go ahead and get another big week out of DeVonta Smith here, I wouldn't be surprised. Let's just talk about some of the performances we have seen wide receivers produce against the Chicago Bears secondary as of late. Christian Watson, 2 touchdowns. Of course, Garrett Wilson, 2 touchdowns, 95 yards. Drake London scores a touchdown against this defense. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 10 catches, 119 and a touchdown. I'm expecting DeVonta Smith to have himself a big week here against Chicago. Moving on, let's talk about Chris Godwin to close out our top 18. Chris Godwin, again, I love Chris Godwin, guys. Don't get me wrong. In a half PPR scoring format, he is a little bit undervalued because his overall receptions don't really carry him as far. He needs touchdown upside and or yardage to pretty much carry his week. That being said, coming off a performance of 5 catches for 54 is not going to get the job done. This offense has looked terrible. And unfortunately, this upcoming week, he has a tough matchup against Mike Hinton, the primary slot cornerback of the Cincinnati Bengals. Like I mentioned, whether it was yesterday or going even into today, the Cincinnati Bengals defense and their team as a whole looks like they're playoff ready. They are in playoff form already in December, and that is exciting to see for those of you who are rooting for the potential fantasy prospects of that team and for potential fans of the Cincinnati Bengals. But Chris Godwin, again, is going to need himself 10-plus targets, and he's going to have to get himself a lot of utilization down in the red zone in order to be a relevant option in the given week against a tough matchup. Moving on, let's talk about the second half of the wide receiver conversation, beginning with Michael Pittman Jr. Speaking of matchups, Michael Pittman Jr. is primarily here because of said matchup. They take on the Minnesota Vikings, which in fact is the easiest, giving up 38.73 half PPR fantasy points per game since week 7. That's the last 8 weeks of incredible performances from wide receivers. Let's just talk about the last 4 games in which Minnesota has taken on opposing wide receivers. As a whole, when you combine wide receiver statistics against this defense, 20 catches, 273, and 3 touchdowns from Detroit. Against the New York Jets, 17 catches, 263. The New England Patriots, 16 catches, 241 and a touchdown. Buffalo Bills, 23 catches, 264 and a touchdown. So we've basically seen a minimum of 240 receiving yards from opposing wide receivers and 16 receptions from opposing wide receivers over the course of the last 4 games alone from this Minnesota secondary. If they're going to continue to play at this level, I'm expecting Michael Pittman Jr., Paris Campbell, and even Alec Pierce to be relevant options. But again, because it's Matt Ryan under center, we'll just go ahead and we'll be, a little bit conservative with the matter and just expect Michael Pittman to be the stud option in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Amari Cooper. I'm going to give Amari Cooper the benefit of the doubt, primarily because, again, even though in the last 2 weeks, he has 9 and 7 targets and has done nothing with those 16 total targets since Watson has pretty much joined this team, it's a pretty good range of opportunity. And if, in fact, he can go ahead and just get a couple more receptions, if this offense continues to air it out, like we've heard their offensive coordinator come out and say they're going to allow Deshaun Watson to continue to air it out moving forward and get him more comfortable in those positions, hopefully Amari Cooper will get into a spot where he can put together a productive week. We know what kind of wide receiver he is. If we can get into a position where Deshaun Watson feels more comfortable with him, we can funnel target him in this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, against Marlon Humphreys. Of course, we just saw Diontae Johnson. What was it, like 5-6 catches for 80 overall receiving yards? I'm expecting Amari Cooper, benefit of the doubt, of course, to have himself a decent week here and hopefully a bounce back performance. Moving on to Brandon Aiyuk. Aiyuk primarily sits in this position because of the injury to Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel, of course, is going to miss, according to Kyle Shanahan, about 3 to 4 weeks. Of course, pretty much an IR stint there. But in his absence, Brandon Aiyuk is going to be asked to be the primary wide receiver option of this team. And that will potentially, hopefully, include some rushing attempts and or more work in the receiving game, allowing him to take upon that Deebo role. Earlier this season, in the only 1 game that Deebo Samuel missed, which was week 8 against the LA Rams, of course, we saw Brandon Aiyuk, 6 targets, 6 catches, 81 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 17.1 half PPR fantasy points. They take on Seattle. I know it's a tougher matchup in the secondary. They haven't been giving up much, but I'm expecting a solid level of production out of Brandon Aiyuk in the given week. Moving on. Let's talk about Jerry Jeudy. Man, Jerry Jeudy coming off an incredible performance of 3 receiving touchdowns. I don't know how he got away with not getting a penalty for shoulder checking the referee while he got in his face. But either way, that's a lot of restraint from the referee, just understanding the situation. This upcoming week, they will probably not have Russell Wilson available. And honestly, that's not a big deal because as soon as we saw Brett Rippon come into the game, with the concussion to Russell Wilson, he immediately looks in the direction of Jerry Jeudy, completes a touchdown pass. Together, in the final, stretch of the game, the final quarter, had himself 2 targets, 2 receptions, 12 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Okay production, but when you look at those numbers, it doesn't really give you the full scope of what the potential is of Jerry Jeudy. But when you go ahead and look at the 3 prior games in which Brett Rypien has been the starting quarterback of the Denver Broncos over the course of the last 3 years now, with Jerry Jeudy active, we have seen Jerry Jeudy average about 8 targets, 5 receptions, 71 receiving yards, and 0.33 touchdowns per game, which is an 11.37 half PPR fantasy point per game average. They take on the Arizona Cardinals secondary. I'm expecting Jerry Jeudy to be a pretty relevant option this upcoming week, especially considering if, in fact, we do not see Courtland Sutton return, of course, dealing with that hamstring injury that could keep him slow to return and potentially a non-factor in the given matchup. Moving on, let's talk about JuJu Smith-Schuster. I was doubtful of the potential of JuJu last week, and quite frankly, I was wrong. He had himself a far more productive week than we potentially anticipated. 11 targets, 9 catches, 74 yards, and a touchdown against the Denver Broncos secondary. That being said, he takes on Houston this week, and we have seen a lot of wide receivers, unfortunately, not have great production, primarily because of the coverages of Houston. They've got pretty good cornerback play there. And primarily, I'm expecting Desmond King to probably lock up. And if that ends up being the case, then of course, many of us are going to be hurt by that. Now, that being said, in the last 3 games that JuJu Smith-Schuster has played 80 or more % of the offensive snaps, he has produced 17.9, 13.8, and 19.8 half PPR fantasy points. That's pretty good production based on the high level of opportunity. The question is, are we going to see that high level of opportunity? Because he's only been able to see 80+% of the offensive snaps, 3 out of the last 6 games. I know he's been dealing with injuries, of course, the concussion, all that kind of jazz, but he needs to be more consistent for us to trust him as a higher level, potential prospect in a given week. Moving on, let's talk about T. Higgins. I can't believe they did it again to us. This is the first time that I'm technically addressing this. The fact of the matter is, the Cincinnati Bengals at times will not be trusted going forward if, in fact, T. Higgins finishes Friday on the injury report as a questionable player. T. Higgins, obviously, already earlier today, was active at practice and he was present, which is great to see. And hopefully going into this week, we're going to get a bounce back performance going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But you never know. The fact of the matter is they keep, a lot of their injury questions, within the shadows. They even said after the game, Zach Taylor said he could have played, but, we didn't need him to play. What the heck is that? He comes out, he played 1 snap, and then he's on the bench the rest of the game. Now, for those of you who are T. Higgins managers, you remember the last time that happened was week 5 against Baltimore, and many of us lost weeks there. Perhaps you lost a week this last week because of the 0-point contribution of Higgins. For right now, he's number 24 because I don't know if I can trust him if, in fact, he's still on the injury report by the time we get to Friday. Moving on, let's talk about Jaylen Waddle. Man, speaking of losing trust, Jaylen Waddle was so good earlier this season. And in the last 4 games, he has completely diminished all of that hope in my heart. I mean, in terms of statistics, last 4 games averaging 6 targets, 3 catches, 48 yards, 0 touchdowns, a 4.78 fantasy point per game average and a half PPR. Now he has to take on the Buffalo Bills secondary, which in my mind, in that weather, in Buffalo, doesn't seem like an incredible matchup. Earlier this season, sure, he was able to find himself 4 catches for 102 yards and 11.1 fantasy points against this matchup, but ultimately the way he's been producing as of late and the matchup in itself, I give him the benefit of the doubt because he's Jaylen Waddle and he has potential, but man, with the way that Tua has been playing as of late, the ranking could end up going down as the week progresses in my mind. Moving on, let's talk about Christian Kirk, another one of these players that we give the benefit of the doubt to because he has had so much success already this season, but momentum is a real thing. And as of late, he hasn't had that momentum on his side to make us 100% active on the idea that, yeah, we have to play him, even when Trevor Lawrence is coming off an incredible week. Yes, Christian Kirk wasn't able to bask in the success that, Zay Jones and or Evan Ingram had. But once teams go ahead and lock those 2 down, there's a potential that Christian Kirk can once again emerge himself into this conversation of being the primary number 1 in this offense and being a dependable fantasy option. Unfortunately, this week they take on the Dallas Cowboys. DaRon Bland, the primary slot cornerback for this defense, has been really good in coverage this season. If, in fact, they move him out to the number 2 spot and they don't have him covering the slot position, that will make Christian Kirk an even more viable play. But I think this is going to be a back-and-forth contest between these 2 teams, higher scoring. Hopefully, Christian Kirk's ready to produce some fantasy points for us. Moving on, let's talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones. I've moved Donovan Peoples-Jones into this conversation primarily because he is exactly what we anticipated him to be back all the way in week 6 when I immediately talked about him. Week 6 was the first time in a waiver wire episode I ever mentioned Donovan Peoples-Jones as a potential pickup. And we said, hey, if he's going to continue to be this successful and consistent, great. He was that consistent. And once he was, we said, hey, once Deshaun Watson comes back, there is a high potential for success that Donovan Peoples-Jones can be a guy for this offense. Coming off of a week, 12 targets, 8 catches, 114 receiving yards. And don't even get me started about the opportunities that he wasn't able to bring down. On those 4 targets that he wasn't able to garner and bring in, one of them, 4th and 1, fake quarterback sneak from Jacoby Brissett, play action, throws it to the end zone, overthrows him. The second one, late in the 4th quarter, fade on the left side, throws it, isn't able to haul it in. Pretty much ricochets off his pads. Definitely an unfortunate outcome. You could see his frustration after he's not able to make the play. But in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, if we're going to have more struggles from Amari Cooper, potentially, Donovan Peoples-Jones could be someone that we want to have on roster going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Baltimore. Should be an advantageous play, especially with Deshaun Watson potentially airing it out even more. Moving on to Adam Thielen, number 28. Adam Thielen has been himself over the course of 2 out of the last 3 weeks, putting up a touchdown in those games, getting himself a high volume of targets and receptions. The question is, can we maintain that level of consistency? If he's going to play on the outside against Isaiah Rodgers, of course, it's not an easy matchup, whether he's going to play in the slot up against Kenny Moore. I believe there's a conversation to be had with Justin Jefferson on one side of the field, taking, of course, the coverage of Stephon Gilmore, if not even, safety double coverage, potentially in that conversation, bracketing him. It opens up more opportunities for these other, receiving options, KJ Osborne and Adam Thielen. If Adam Thielen is going to continue to benefit because of the high levels of success that we are seeing Justin Jefferson on the other side of the field produce, I'm expecting another big week here for Adam Thielen. Moving on, let's talk about Zay Jones, who has benefited himself from just being, active in this offense and continuing to find himself open. Unfortunately, Zay Jones dropped himself a 40-yard receiving touchdown in the 3rd quarter. It was in the breadbasket. He was standing in the end zone. He had 2 steps on the guy, that was covering him. Unfortunately, wasn't able to bring it in. And even later in that game, wasn't able to complete a catch for a 25-yard touchdown. Zay Jones is one of the favorite targets of Trevor Lawrence, and it's apparent. He has had himself 8 or more receptions in 3 out of the last 4 games. We have him here in this low-end conversation. As long as he's healthy and going into this week at a full capacity, against Dallas could be a great play. I know Trayvon Diggs is most likely going to be the matchup, which is tough, but that's why he sits at 29. Moving on to DJ Moore, number 30. Coming off of another goose egg here of a player. 0.6 fantasy points isn't going to get it done. That being said, DJ Moore has the potential to get it back in the right direction. Again, we've mentioned this. In the games that he has played with Sam Darnold over his career, when Sam Darnold is the starter and hasn't left early with an injury, we have seen him average over 12 half PPR fantasy points per game. And even though his performance this last week was underwhelming, they had opportunities. Of course, Sam Darnold just wasn't able to be accurate enough in said opportunities to make it a perfect fantasy play. We had one, goal line fade, unfortunately, inaccurate pass, wasn't able to take advantage of. Another play, 20 yards down the field, wide open, isn't able to put it on him, makes it a difficult reception, wasn't able to bring it in. If in fact you can get a little bit more consistency out of Darnold, especially going up against Pittsburgh secondary, who recently, 6 catches, 95 to Drake London, 7 catches, 61 and a touchdown to Michael Pittman Jr., 9 catches for 148 from T. Higgins, and 6 catches for 156 and 3 touchdowns to A.J. Brown. Number 1 wide receivers have dominated against the secondary. DJ Moore could be another one of them. Moving on. We have Marquise Brown. I believe the injury to Kyler Murray is definitely going to impact the overall upside of Marquise Brown. The coexistence of 2 number 1 alpha wide receivers within an offense is going to be far more difficult to uphold with the amount of targets that they both require to be those number 1 options. So going forward, it's probably going to be DeAndre Hopkins as the number 1. And the second fiddle within this receiving offense is going to be Marquise Brown. We know for a fact that, of course, Kyler Murray's gone. We know for a fact that Rondale Moore is hitting the injured reserve. The absence of Moore could end up giving more opportunities towards Marquise Brown. But again, Robbie Anderson steps up in that position and ends up garnering targets. In my mind, Marquise Brown needs a touchdown to be relevant, unless he's going to see a ridiculously high target count. And at this current moment in time, he's capable of taking the top off the defense. It's just a matter of whether or not this offense is going to set him up to potentially succeed in those kind of opportunities. Moving on. Let's talk about Chris Olave. Chris Olave in the last 3 games that he has played, 5 catches, 102 and a touchdown, 5 catches, 64, 4 catches, 65. We know the kind of base minimum he's going to produce. It's about 8.5 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. Anything more than that is incredible. Unfortunately, even though many of us think that the Atlanta Falcons matchup going into the week is an advantageous one, I do not believe that to be the case. Going over the last couple weeks of production from wide receiver ones against this defense, Diontae Johnson, 5 catches, 60. Terry McLaurin, 4 catches, 48. Darnell Mooney, 4 catches, 29. DJ Moore, 4 catches, 29. Wide receiver ones over the course of the last couple weeks have been, quite frankly, inconsistent against this defense, or consistently bad, if you want to just put it that way. I think Chris Olave could be in a little bit of trouble, especially with Andy Dalton really not playing well as of late. Moving on to Elijah Moore, number 33. Elijah Moore, the last time we saw him, 10 targets, 6 catches, 60 yards. If, in fact, we're going to see Corey Davis miss some time going into the week, and the Detroit Lions defense plays as well as I expect them to do in terms of stopping the run against Zonovan Knight, and, of course, the efforts of Michael Carter and Ty Johnson, there may be a conversation here where not only Garrett Wilson, but Elijah Moore is going to dominate. I mean, just this last week, all 3 of the primary wide receivers for the Minnesota Vikings, JJ, KJ Osborne, and Adam Thielen all scored a touchdown. You go back a couple weeks, Christian Kirk, 6 catches, 104 from the slot position. And we even saw Stefon Diggs and Isaiah McKenzie both score touchdowns against this defense. If they're not going to be able to run the ball, I'm expecting Elijah Moore to get himself a high volume of targets. Moving on, let's talk about Diontae Johnson. This is the first time I've had Diontae Johnson here in quite some time. It's primarily because Mitch Trubisky and Mason Rudolph were splitting number 1 snaps in earlier today's practice. That was the report. If in fact we're going to continue with that, I'm expecting a base minimum of 10 targets, getting back to that 10 target streak, and hopefully production that will follow at a consistent wide receiver 3 level. Moving on to Mike Evans, our number 35. I don't know if I can trust Mike Evans anymore. Every week I say something's got to give. Last week, literally blown coverage, wide open, 66-yard touchdown, trots into the end zone, offensive holding. Number 76 again. Second week in a row where either Godwin and or Evans gets a touchdown called back. Donovan Smith needs to figure it out. He really does. You either got to replace him or he's just got to stop holding. At the moment, Mike Evans is on a 9-game streak of not scoring a touchdown. I've never seen anything like this, especially from a guy who the last 2 seasons has put up a minimum of 13 touchdowns both years. As of right now, Mike Evans is on a down trot, and because of it, we might want to avoid him. Moving on, let's talk about Treylon Burks, our final option here. Treylon Burks, if in fact he's able to clear concussion protocol, in my mind is a top 36 wide receiver option going up against the Los Angeles Chargers secondary. That being said, I also wanted to take some time to not only mention the potential upside of Treylon Burks, but other guys that could have been mentioned on this top 36 list. And by the time we get to Sunday, could be in this conversation. Guys like Alec Pierce, Darius Slayton, and even guys that are associated with those offenses, Paris Campbell, even the potential of, Richie James, if he's able to clear concussion protocol, Isaiah Hodgins, like we talked about on Monday, guys like George Pickens, Drake London, they could be top 36 players in this given week. Got to do a little bit more research on them, and once we get there, we could probably have that adjusted again. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on my latest content. Of course, click the bell notification button to stay up to date as to when I'm live streaming. This Saturday and Sunday, I will be live streaming here on the channel. So be sure to swing on by, ask questions, and of course, check out the rankings that are updated on screen when in fact I'm live streaming. Thank you everybody for watching. That's going to cover it in terms of top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 15. Good luck on your matchups. Of course, tomorrow's game is going to be exciting. Tomorrow we'll have our quarterback and tight end rankings prior to the Thursday night football game. Until then, thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to check out PrizePicks again. Be sure to use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first-time deposit, because that first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Again, the 12 Days of Pickmas is going on right now, and the current day promotion is if in fact you put together a play of $25, you get a free entry to win $100. You can go ahead and check that out today via PrizePicks. Check out their entries and or check out PrizePicks/Pickmas to get all the full details regarding the given promotion. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.